Welcome to Reach, your platform to connect with other executive assistants and acquire game-changing knowledge and perspective. Reach is designed to inspire your workday, guide you through pivotal moments in your career, and transform you into the executive assistant you've always wanted to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Reach. This is your host, Jessica Van. I'm the founder and CEO of Maven Recruiting Group, and I am joined today by Candace Deans. Hi, Candace.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to start this conversation.
Me too. I remember that even before we talked to you about being a guest, you had mentioned that you were a listener first. So this is very full circle.
Yeah, I feels very serendipitous right now.
Awesome. That's great. Well, Candace is currently the Senior Executive Business Partner to the CEO of Samsara. And we'll be getting into a little bit more of her role a little bit later in our conversation. But the main thing that Candace is here to discuss with us today is with regard to our subject matter of the moment, which is viewpoints on DE&I in the workplace. So as a little bit of a prelude, we know that today's workspaces function very differently than they did even, let's say a year ago. We have post-COVID era accommodations that have fundamentally shifted how we work and how we organize as employees and as a culture. So a different kind of effort really needs to be made to maintain human connections that we typically would form when we work alongside of each other. And I think an important aspect of these connections that contribute to company culture is benefiting from an inclusive and diverse workspace. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be speaking with Candace. And in addition to her current role supporting Samsara's CEO, she's had an illustrious career prior, performing in roles that have uniquely qualified her to navigate this topic of how the working world is shifting. And she's been, prior to her current role, the executive business partner to the chief people and diversity officer at Twitter, and ultimately shifted to the human resources business partner role post their acquisition. So Candace has had really exclusive access and contribution to how DE&I is approached and implemented in a large technology dynamic organization. So you are officially a subject matter expert.
Wow.
Great. So welcome. Let's start by getting a little bit of background on you and a little biography. So I have to mention that you graduated from Fordham, which is obviously a very competitive and prestigious institution. And you earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree there, something that is very impressive. I'd love to understand how that translated or how that's translated your academic learning, and particularly an advanced degree, how that's translated into your work as an assistant and into just your workflows.
Oh, thank you so much for asking. And I just wanted to stop and say thank you so much for having me here. I'm super excited about Maven and kind of how you all build connections in the administrative and HR community. So really excited to dive into our discussion today. So as you mentioned, yes, I did get my master's and undergraduate degree at Fordham University. And basically, it's interesting because I took both of those degrees in totally two different realms. So my undergraduate degree was in fashion merchandising, and my graduate degree was in communications and media studies. And during that time, while I was in school getting my graduate degree, I was a resident director. So it runs the gamut. And so I think that degree in both cases, especially in both my undergraduate and graduate degree, undergraduate, as you know, in fashion merchandising, you're paying very close attention to either details and even how people visually walk into a space. And I've been able to translate that, especially as an executive assistant and moving into how I plan events, and not just with the agenda criteria, but also with locations. How do you want your executives and the teams to feel when they walk in? What is the goal of that particular offsite? And so kind of that undergraduate degree helped train my eye a little bit more on like what makes a space beautiful, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in terms of like my communications degree, as you know, you have to talk to and speak with a bunch of different people and different types of personalities. And so in that instance, honing in the different communication styles, whether it be more informal or formal, how to communicate clearly and effectively, especially when you want to get something done in a collaborative setting. All of that encompassed kind of what I learned in communications and media studies, also in well as taking that into like the tech world. Me working for social media companies like Facebook and Twitter. And as I was, getting my degree, in my graduate degree and working as a resident director, I think it was, I mean, as you know, it's heavily administrative and interpersonal, again, connections that you'll need to make with either your undergraduate residents or different tasks that you need to complete on your own, different time management that was needed so that you could, make strides throughout your day, also studying and also doing your work. So, I mean, I think my whole time at Fordham really set me up really well for my trajectory that I'm doing right now.
And was it your intention that you would end up in EA work, or did it sort of happen? You used the word serendipitous earlier. I like that. I love that word actually. Do you feel like it was serendipity that you ended up in this profession, or was it an intentional trajectory on your part?
It materialized serendipitously. I love using that word as well. So basically, I let me rephrase a little bit. I had worked with, as you know, many different people in my undergraduate degree and kind of took a stop during about 2 years trying to figure out leaving New York and just trying to figure out where was my next step. And so my sister-in-law, who currently lives in the Bay Area, had started her own company. And in that time, she had obviously seen all of the different things that I had done and offered me a position. But what it was requiring was that I would move out to California and help her build up her startup. At the time, they only had about 10 people, and what they needed was someone to be basically, as people have heard, kind of the Jill or jack of all trades inside of the office, who could handle HR, who could handle scheduling, who could handle office kind of management in terms of ordering supplies and things like that. And I jumped at the chance because I had done a lot of different things. I understand how to manage my time. And so, with that trust that she put in me, is where I ended up making my decision to move over to the Bay Area. And that kind of like opened the floodgates, as you can say.
Yeah. Yeah, quite literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you started, so as you mentioned, I mean there were a couple of roles that preceded, but I think if we look at your decision to go to Facebook, which was, as you mentioned, not your first EA position, but you were there nevertheless a little bit far or a little bit further along in your career. So you started your career at Facebook just about 2 years after all of the really titan organizations that we think of when we think of Silicon Valley. Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft. After these players released their first ever diversity reports, I'm curious to what extent, well, I guess A of all, was that even on your radar when you were evaluating Facebook as a place to work? And if it was, to what extent did the content and results of those reports impact your decision about where you wanted to work?
Yeah, I would say that it wasn't technically in terms of Facebook in general and the diversity reports, they weren't completely on my radar. But what I will say is that I come from spaces that weren't very diverse and wanted to make sure that the next spot that I landed um, cultivated that in some way. And so when I first interviewed for Facebook, I actually met with a woman who was a woman of color, and she was supporting the chief product officer at the time. And even to this day, I see her as my mentor. And in seeing her, I saw myself at a place like Facebook, which to me gained a lot of insight into what I was hoping that the company trajectory was when it came to having diverse faces in different roles within the tech industry. And so that is one of the reasons too why I did make the decision to go to Facebook, really based off of that interaction and being able to see myself at a place like that.
Got it. So it was more what she represented and your interaction with her as an individual, as opposed to kind of their macro report.
Correct. I will say at the time, looking at the reports, they were pretty abysmal, mainly because of how large, Facebook and the Googles are. I think they hovered at around 2% at the time of when I joined. And so it felt when you saw the numbers, it did feel kind of small. But I will say that in my everyday interactions, I had a lot of different diverse faces that I got to see across the board. And so that did give me hope, of that, things have to eventually evolve and change. And it did make me feel that the company was trying to keep a pulse on hiring and interaction in that arena. So, though the numbers didn't look very large, I think in the day to day, it was nice to see multiple different types of faces and experiences when I worked at Twitter or at Facebook. So sorry.
Yeah. Well, now that's kind of where my next question was headed, which is, did your experience as an employee line up with their, these professed diversity goals? And it does sound like what you're saying is that you did have these diverse interactions. So there was some, evidence of that being not only a goal, but actually an actual thing and an achievement. But I'm curious if you felt like there was synchronicity, at Facebook, at Twitter, in alignment in terms of the professed intention and what actually was the case.
Yeah, I will say, I think basically ERGs play a huge role in this, and that's in employee group resources. That is usually where I got my boost of really understanding the experiences across the board, and also felt like the company was putting their dollars too behind what they're saying in reports and out externally. Both Twitter and Facebook, Meta, have very deep ERG connections that had help cultivate, what you would want to see at a company at that time when I was working there, meaning that they put money behind any person who helped chair those ERG groups, meaning they would get an additional stipend, which is really great because you're spending your additional time outside of your job to help build community connection, which also then translates over into the recruiting world. Also, in terms of, really supporting times where you were looking at candidates to make sure that you position yourself in different, whether they be like job fairs or recruiting events that were really geared toward a predominantly people of color population, was very helpful, I think, and also showed that they were making a conscious effort to make sure that they were out there grabbing different types of candidates, as well as helping to bring those candidate or those employees along, as in terms of the career journey that they wanted to have. Um, so that was great. I will say, in terms of both of those instances, I found it difficult a bit in terms of seeing who was getting promoted and also making sure that it didn't just happen on the IC level, but it also translated into senior directors and VPs and things like that. And so that was always. I feel like that is even right now is difficult for a lot of tech companies to kind of hone in and make sure that they're up leveling or also recruiting those candidates that are diverse in talent in those levels.
Hmm. And when you talk about the ERG groups, can you maybe share some examples with our listeners of what some of those groups were and what their kind of manifests were?
Yeah, so it runs the gamut, but most of the time I've seen employee research groups geared towards pride, so those individuals for the LGBTQ plus community, also those who identify as Black Americans have a ERG, as well as women in tech, which is huge, as you know. That really has been made headways in the diversity and inclusion space, especially from when they started doing those reports until now. There's a lot more women and a lot more women leadership within technology. Um, Also, employee research groups that have to do with those who have different abilities. And we used to call it at Twitter Able, parent resource groups. So it really ran the gamut of what do you have that personally that helps you identify and you bring that to work. We want to make sure that when you come into the office, you feel included and that there's no exclusionary anything happening at the office based off of race, religion, creed, etc.
That gives a good kind of representation of some of the groups, some of the exposures that they're actively trying to cultivate and just, generate awareness for. So, okay. So, digging into your time at Twitter, you started by supporting the chief design officer. And as you've already mentioned, you studied fashion merchandising at Fordham. So, is it somewhat apropos that happened and that sort of came together in that way? And if so, how were you able to integrate your sense of design into your understanding of operations and of what your executive did in that role?
Yeah, I believe so. I started supporting teams that were specifically design related at Facebook. And so there, I think I got, they spoke the same language as me. Really, designers are very into the details. They do like simplicity. And especially when you're working in technology, you want things to be my VP would say simple, lovable, and complete. So you know exactly what button to click, you love going on there, and you have a complete experience once you've finished. And so anything that put too many clicks in the way or made it too hard for you to get to your end goal was not something that you went into or that you wanted to continue to iterate on. And in that, I just really got the chance to hone in and also bring to light my love for detail and design, whether it was understanding where we are in the product design process and understanding his language of what makes a good product, especially when it comes to technology, also into the space of how do I help create spaces for designers to feel that they are in an experience that's curated for them. So I paid close attention. I asked them questions about what types of setups did they like, what types of rooms or colors that made them feel like they were able to collaborate. And in that, I was able to bring that and translate that into each of the events and things that I cultivated for both of my teams and for my executive when I started working with him.
I love that. I think that that's a really very powerful but also really relatable example. I mean, just like like you talk about what colors make you feel powerful, what colors make you feel engaged or calm or whatever the case may be. I mean, there is a lot of leeway as assistants that we can take in terms of amplifying the experience of people, and color and, as you mentioned, design in general are all like two very significant ways of doing that.
Yeah. And I would also, in regards to just also knowing your audience, I think the interesting thing that executive assistants have is that you are the first face. You get to know your executives team and what they need, and understanding those details makes it even that much better in terms of creating an event that feels really inclusive, that feels like someone's been seen. Can you imagine? There's an example of when we were putting together an offsite for first one in a while, and everyone was since the pandemic, and everyone was going to be in person, and we had just hired this VP who was wheelchair bound, and he- as we curated the event, we made sure that each piece was um, able able for him to feel like he can navigate the space on his own. We wanted to make sure we had enough space between things. We wanted to make sure that we had ramps there for him. And literally at the end of the event, he thanked me because he was like, I knew that you were going to make sure that I can get to each location and feel like I was a part of the group, and there was nothing left to where, I couldn't be a part of. And so, like, that's the kind of thing, especially when you're also working and you're doing these events or just creating spaces that can be very inclusive, is to keep those things in mind. Um, how do we make something feel unique and special to every individual who's going to be participating?
Right. And inclusive. Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really good point. And I know we'll talk a little bit later in our conversation about how you as an EA can impact diversity goals and inclusion goals. And I think that what your example illustrates as a really powerful reminder is that it doesn't necessarily need to be at a policy level. It might be at a policy level, and that's something that we can get into later on. But at a minimum, it can be at an experience level. And I think that's a really great example that you just shared of how those your role and those values can align. So, when you decided to move on to support the chief people and diversity officer at Twitter, what was the driving force behind your decision to move from the chief design officer to the chief people and diversity officer?
Well, one major driver was that he had made the decision to leave Twitter, and
That'll
so
do it.
I mean that'll change
Yeah.
it. Because he made that decision, I wasn't quite sure, and he wasn't quite sure of his next location, um, and so I hadn't completely decided that I no longer wanted to work at Twitter. I just knew that it had to be the right fit, and that's always been a big reason of why I choose which execs I end up working with. And so at the time, the chief people and diversity officer, she was also looking, had some changes, and also was super new. She wasn't new to the company, but she was new to the role. And so this was going to be her first C-suite role, and really was looking for the type of support that I provide, which is more along the lines of kind of getting a little bit more into the weeds of not just scheduling, but also understanding what is the company objectives and goals, and trying to figure out how to best position my executive in both internally and externally to kind of achieve those. And she's also a woman of color. And so I hadn't been able to work with a woman of color. And I had in my working with the chief design officer, but I wanted to continue that trajectory. I find that because you don't have very many leaders who are sitting in the C-suite, being a woman and a woman of color, I thought that that was a very powerful place for her to be in. And I thought I could definitely learn a lot from her. Um, and so that was ultimately why we became a really great fit together.
Yeah, that's great. So when you made the switch to support the chief diversity officer at Twitter, did you find there to be any intra company culture differences on her desk versus on the chief design officer's desk?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is more along the lines of people policy, right? I think in terms of the chief design officer, we're really looking at the product. You can think of us that team more as like the R&D team and working really closely with just the actual pixels and the handheld product that you're delivering. And in her at her desk, it was really all about the individual workers. How do we create and give clarity to policies that are going to either up level our teams, give clarity around different policies that we have in terms of the global parenting policy, things like that, even equity in regards to compensation. How do we make that transparent? So it was very people related. And so to me, it was really different and also really exciting because as a person who's been working with people my whole career and understanding those type of policies and being able to explain it to employees, I felt it was super powerful and really interesting. Um, so yeah, it was definitely different.
And did you feel in that role that there was an opportunity to lend your voice or your perspective or your input to some of these people, policies, and practices, or not so much?
Oh yeah, no, definitely could lend my voice. I think the chief people and diversity officer really wanted to hear what an IC's experience was, especially too as an executive assistant. What I've found is that this is one of those roles that sometimes it's not necessarily that it's overlooked, but they can be um, configured in different ways. You can report directly into your CEO or whoever your person is that you're supporting into your executive, or you could be reporting into somewhat of a peer, but an EA manager. And in each instance, you have differences of what your career journey is going to look like. How is your career progression going to look like? And so I was able to kind of lend a voice to that IC mentality of like, okay, if you're going to launch this new quarterly check-in, what does that look like for an IC? What's the lift? How are those conversations going to go? In my experience, it's been why, and I think that was helpful for the team because, as you know, in as the chief people and diversity officer, her role ran the gamut from recruiting all the way to performance slash career management and as well as compensation. And so being able to be in the room with those who help set the standards for those things that are basically foundations of every company was pretty cool. And I was able to really lend my voice and in my experience, especially too because I had been with the company for a while before I transitioned, and so I could give the perspective of we've released this last year, and this is what I heard from my team. This is what I heard from the managers on the design team of how it worked for them. Maybe we should think about seeing if we can change timelines, certain things like that.
Yeah, that's great. So oftentimes we find that it's necessary to educate or carry out extra somewhat, I'm putting in quotation marks, air quotes, unofficial duties when it comes to imparting wisdom, right? That's been gained over your life as part of a marginalized group or an underrepresented group. How did this come into play, or did you feel that this came into play for you in each of your roles? And I would say particularly, perhaps supporting the chief people officer and diversity officer at Twitter.
Yes, and I would say that I think during that time was post George Floyd, and post a lot of the things that were happening in our world. And so Twitter at that time was very uniquely tuned that these conversations are happening externally. And so, as a company, they wanted to lean in to make sure that employees felt okay to have the space to confront them within the office, because, as you know, those events were pretty heavy. And so, to say you want someone to bring their authentic self to work, but yet you can't talk about maybe something that's really hurting you as an individual and especially your community, was very difficult. And I think a lot of companies took the time to pause to kind of let there be space to have those kind of conversations, or to just take a step away. Um, what I did do during that time was just, I think I leaned into the fact that as much as I wanted to educate, I tried to communicate. There's some things that I'm not going to be able to explain wholeheartedly, but just know that this time will be a time where we'll all need to kind of like reevaluate those types of conversations and how we bring them up, if that makes sense.
Did you feel like you were being asked to represent, you know, to represent a group, or that, and to kind of speak on behalf of a group? Or did you
Yeah,
feel like, yeah, I mean, I'm like,
I get
was
I
there
get
sort
your
of an, yeah, like, was there an
Mhm.
unofficial expectation of you to sort of be the spokesperson for the Black community in any way during things like this? Like, did you ever
Yeah.
feel that sort of, that came with the territory,
I
especially because you were supporting the person that you were supporting, right? It's sort
Mhm,
of like,
mhm.
if anything, I almost feel like it's double layered, because there's your identity as an individual, and then there's also the persona that you play as the person who supports the chief diversity officer. So it's sort of a very layered experience for you. And
Yes.
I'm curious if that was kind of amplified in your time and in your interactions at Twitter.
Yeah. I will say that that is something that each person who is at any type of a marginalized community, it's a weight you carry no matter what state you walk into. And I say that in the fact of like, it doesn't, even though I reported into the chief diversity officer, and yes, it would make sense that I would have maybe insight, or that I would be a spokesperson. But I think that that was something that I've, because I'm a Black woman, that that's something that I always carry, and I've always had to be the spokesperson. I think during this time, what it did do is open others' eyes into not putting people of color or any marginalized community in that space, especially during times of what is a very heavy experience. And so that was the conversation that we were mostly having at the time, was that now let's recognize that we've probably put people in a situation where they've had to be the spokesperson. Was that right? And that was, a big time when, I don't, if you've heard, like a lot of allyship conversation came up. Um, and I think that was one thing that sparked and was one of those things that we pushed more forward, especially during that time. And as I've seen now, even, is that let's now have an allyship conversation where, if there's times where I'm putting a marginalized community in a space where I'm making them be the spokesperson or be the single quote unquote voice for a community. Maybe I need to look at that and how can I redirect my good intent, because I feel like a lot of people may have a good intent in wanting to get to know, but it also puts the other individual in a space where they feel like they're the only, and I'm going to be the spokesperson for a full community when there's different experiences, there's different walks of life. You never know two Black people have the same experience. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think for sure. I definitely, so in the instance that, yes, I think they did try to do that, but I think for Twitter especially, and then other companies, I think now are really pushing back to make sure that we, not pushing back, but um, are creating spaces to have more of an allyship conversation on how to um, create spaces that aren't like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in hindsight, thinking as you look and reflect retroactively on how you and also how Twitter navigated that time, are you are you overall content or satisfied with how those conversations unfolded, or are there things that you think going forward you would do or advise differently? I mean, that was obviously like one of the most contentious times in our society and in our culture, um, and of course, again, magnified through the looking glass of you working at Twitter, who's I mean that their whole existence and reason for being is to create this platform for discussion, debate, for people to voice and share opinions about popular culture and sentiment. So I feel like it's almost like a hyper experience that you must have gone through going through that, and then also just the nature of Twitter's business and what they do. So overall, like, are you satisfied with how those events were kind of handled or explored
Hmm.
during your
Yeah.
time there?
I would say yes. I think the team at the time did as much as you could do, right? Yeah, we were not together. We had to run a lot of things via Zoom or virtually, and in doing so, you also kind of have to have people be willing to sign up to have a conversation or to invite external speakers. And that's really what they leaned into. I think what was great that Twitter didn't do is that they did not try to cultivate these conversations on their own. They brought in experts. They had the conversations with those who were doing the work out in the community, which was great, versus it being somebody putting something together in a back room with only working for so that it got a specific outcome. They also even held spaces where it was just to listen, because there's no how should you say, there's no band-aid, there's no everything's going to be okay during a time when there's so much outside turmoil, and all people want to do is be able to voice their concerns as humans, and note that you voicing that concern doesn't mean that there's any type of backlash or that you're going to be looked at weird because you're having a moment that's really affecting you internally. um, and so that was, I think they did a really good job during that time as much as they could. Since you're not going to be in shared spaces, and we all know human touch is, you can't replace that, but being able to have a space to be open and honest really meant a lot to a lot of the employees as well as myself during those times.
Yeah, yeah. How do you think, and we touched on this a little bit earlier when you, excuse me, when you shared the example of the event that you created for the employee that was wheelchair bound, but how do you think, kind of generally speaking, DE&I can best be implemented and promoted by those working in support roles to be able to really maximize its efficacy?
Yeah. So a couple of things. Like for me, I always made it a big understanding and an understanding between myself, my executive, and myself. There are certain things that I particularly want to be a part of. So we would have that conversation. In the early days at Facebook, I was also supporting the VP of engineering, and he was not a person of color, but as working in engineering, I started to pay attention of what were the faces that I was seeing in the room. And so I brought up to him, after a few years, that I've noticed, like we are not hiring a very diverse slate of, individuals. And so he agreed with me, actually, which I thought was amazing. And took the time to I basically took the time to figure out what places, what speaking engagements internally could we have him at, to kind of, just like broaden the horizon of like what engineers that he could possibly speak with and maybe mentor or just have a conversation with. And that's kind of how he got into more of like a diverse candidate slate and being able to mentor Black and Brown engineers and help bring them along to other levels. And so I think EAs have a really unique opportunity, one, to be transparent with what they're interested in, and then also ask the question of like, where do you see you want your team to go? Where do you feel like the diversity, I don't know, diversity like downfalls are happening?
Yeah, and where are the diversity opportunities at the same
Correct,
time,
correct,
right?
correct.
Yeah,
What are the
totally.
opportunities, and like, what do you wanna, like, pay close attention to? And make sure you make space for it, bring it up when you see something happening that's happening internally, for, women in tech, and say, "Oh, you mentioned to me last week that you really wanted to get closer to, um, women in tech and technology. Here's this event that they're running. Would you wanna speak at it?" Like, things like that, that help, um, bring your executive along, and you can also be an advocate for some of the things that are happening in the DEI space.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And I think that holds for really every facet of your role as an assistant. Is It's to hold up the looking glass and to say, are you aware of this? This is what I see. Do you see this too? Are you interested in seeing this? To point out the blind spots, to point out what you're seeing. And that, again, that holds for everything. It's not just in the space of diversity and diversity goals, but it's in absolutely everything. It's in, monitoring their their engagement with people, their connection with people, how they're being received. I mean, all of those things. And I do think that the work of an assistant is often to identify the blind spots that we see that they may not. And that's a perfect example of how you can do that really effectively and powerfully and measurably, right? For that
Yeah.
entire organization.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I mean, I think there's a lot of conversations that I've had, not just, like you said, not just in DEI, but just holding up the looking glass of how would you like your organization to run? And you're kind of you are that person who's really close to that executive's direct staff, but then also the rest of the organization. They see you as like the gatekeeper or the person who has the answers on like, this mannerism he or she did today, what does that mean? Were they into it? Were they not into it? Like, you're kind of the you're the executive whisperer per se. Um, and so in that aspect, there's things that you see, or that employees feel comfortable talking to you about, that you have to be willing and to bring to your executive. I did have my chief design officer. He was definitely that way, where he knew that I was getting information that was like outside of what he would see every day. And so he really leaned on me sometimes in our one-on-ones, and he's like, "What's the pulse? What's the pulse of the team?" is what he would say. And that was the way that we kind of like kept each other in the know of like how everyone's doing, and then also like how he could possibly come off or do certain things in a different way that can help land a little bit better with the internal team.
Totally. I mean, it's like you're looking at a more enlightened executive or company when, for instance, like if we're reviewing a job spec and they talk about things like that, they talk about saying, help to gauge, team members, alignment, things like that. Like that, that's an executive that gets it and sees that that's a really meaningful feedback channel, the relationship with the EA and the executive in that regard. And I also think it's a really important reminder because I definitely hear a lot of assistants say, well, I want to have more impact. I want to be able to feel like, like my voice or my contributions are reverberated throughout the organization. I don't just want to put meetings on the calendar and things like that. I mean, I think what you're illustrating is like a really significant example of how you can have and achieve those kinds of reverberations and shockwaves for an entire organization. You may not be the one per se that is whatever handing out the offer letter to that candidate, but that behind the scenes, you were the one that told your executive, I'm not really seeing, a diverse community being represented here. Here's some things we can do about that. And that 100% creates reverberations. I kind of, it reminds me, I remember one time I interviewed a candidate who, supported like a chief medical officer or chief scientist or something like that. And she said something along the lines of, well, I'm not the one that's, curing the cancer or whatever. And I said, well, that's true. You're not, but look at the things that you are doing. And it's like everything has, what is it? They call that like the butterfly
Butterfly
effect,
effect, yes, yes. Everything
right?
does
And
have a butterfly effect.
yeah, and I think
It
that's a
goes
really
down.
important reminder that there's not only one way to drive impact, and to really be able to recognize your influence and your power and find the opportunities to exhibit that.
Yeah, and I mean, what I also would say is that, in terms of impact, there's lots of ways, especially within the executive assistant community, that helps make that impact, and that's really global across the whole organization. I, for one, like to pay attention to how the culture thinks of executive assistants, and how they try to career develop or give trajectory to those in executive assistant roles, mainly because there's ways to collaborate with your own peers as well that help to make shockwaves on how a whole function basically operates. And everybody benefits from that. It's not just your quote unquote team, but it's the teams out in different pieces of the organization all benefit when there is an EA culture that's super collaborative, that's really engaged, understands how to work seamlessly with each other in terms of getting things either done for a large scale things or even just like minute details that make everyone move faster and more efficiently and to get things on the calendar. So I always say like actually executive assistants really are like the backbone of a company, because without them a lot of things just wouldn't move as efficiently.
That's for sure. That is 100%. Yes. So we talked about this a little bit, just how you worked at Twitter during some very interesting times. I mean, it was kind of like dog years in a way because it was just it was a lot of intense and intensive situations that hit the fan. So you happen to work there, as you already mentioned, during the George Floyd incident. You joined 3 years after the 2016 presidential election. And then about 3 years after that, Twitter was, of course, acquired by Elon Musk, which the entire world knows about. So both of those events, and if we add in, George Floyd's event as well. I mean, I think all of these events had a really profound impact on popular culture in terms of how we communicate publicly and in the public space. Also, in social media and the social media space, particularly through the lenses of race and gender. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or perspective on how these events reverberated internally and how they kind of, were felt and experienced internally as an employee.
Yeah. Um, what I for the former, in terms of how it reverberated in terms of like George Floyd and the pandemic and things that were happening in the Asian community, um, the way that impacted employees was really, and I think everyone was a bit more in a way that we wanted to also be able to have the conversations that everyone was having on our platform. And so that is why there was a big push in being able to have external speakers, have, we would call them open forums, to just let teams and internal employees be able to have the conversations um, that were happening externally on our platform. Um, as well as in terms of like the presidential election, I think, our teams really, we paid more close attention to those high pressure times, when we were really in the spotlight, especially with the more recent election, that we wanted to pay attention to having like mental space. I think we paid, in terms of wellness, like being able to pull off and dial back. So there was a internal push for rest days, during that time, to have like a time during the week where once a month, that wasn't, a holiday, that you could like get things done. I think that also really helped during the pandemic because everyone was just like, everything was at home, right? We were like, going to work and then all of a sudden switching to like do homework for the kids and then, going to make dinner, and it was all like in the same space and nothing had its separation. That I think a lot of people needed that wellness or mental check-in to just kind of like, let me take a day to where I can actually get things done for myself versus being everything all the time in the same location and not going outside or not standing up. Um, and then when it came to the change with the acquisition, I will say that that was probably the more sadder moments, at Twitter. And the main of the reason why is that, it's really difficult to go through change, and especially a change that was, once a public company, now a private company, and a single person, is making the decisions that, it lends itself to a more restrictive reality. Um, Whereas like Twitter had come from a very inclusive, everyone, very open, transparent communication, to where it now has to move to a place where it can't be as open, it can't be as transparent. And that was a really hard time. And so those events reverberated in a way where a lot of people just had to like sit down and have the conversation with self, is that, are they along for the journey? Um, and that's what ends up happening during times of change, is kind of like, as you're starting to see things, become more restrictive or become a little bit more, enterprise focused, as they may need to be, does that jive with who you are as a person? And I think that was, just an interesting time to see that shift internally, and like how people and how we had to navigate through that time.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Following Twitter, you started a role at Samsara where you support the CEO. Can you just briefly touch on what Samsara does?
Yeah. So basically, Samsara is like the technical operations of things around the world. So logistically, we work on the sensors and dash cams that you may see in trucking and logistics fleets across the globe to help things get to where they need to be. So, like, if you've ever thought about how that carton of milk gets from the store to your home, or even to the factory to the store to your home, that is what we serve. So it's a very different type of technology. Super sustainable in the fact of like, yes, it's hardware, but it's also data cloud storage and trying to make a lot of the operations of the day to day very simple for those who are in those industries.
Mm-hmm. Great. And you are supporting a CEO for the first time in your career,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a big transition and a big change for you. So do you feel like any of the experiences that you've shared with us in this conversation today, particularly in supporting human resources, supporting really the people org, which you had such a significant contribution to at Twitter. And even going back to your design days, like, do you feel like these experiences have informed your approach to this work and in particular to supporting a CEO?
Oh my gosh, yes. I will say, like, everything that I've gone through has definitely geared up to this point. Um, Especially in the way of I kind of need to be in the know of all the different pieces that are happening. And be very forward thinking. I think the one thing that this role is pushing me to do is like literally make plans a year in advance. So I right now have already planned out his calendar for 2024 and what trips they're taking, where we're going on the road and things like that. Um, because a CEO has a very limited amount of time, and you want to make sure that you're thinking holistically about where they need to strategically spend their time and actually how much percentage of that time is being utilized for things of building up the company versus doing some external engagements versus um, talking with board members and talking with investors. And so it's much more into like the actual run the business of what it is to, run an actual public company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many learnings in what you just described. And I think that, as you point out so well, it's the macro versus the micro. Not that supporting us another C level is micro, because I understand it's not, but I think that the purview of the CEO is just different. It is unilateral across the board. It's everything.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
completely different. And I think,
That's totally different.
and I that's the piece that I'm learning and I'm, getting more familiar with is that, you're just thinking on much more of a larger scale than just like your own individual team. It all kind of flows together. But what's cool about this is that where we're thinking of, what road mapping planning looks like and things like that, we're planning for a whole fiscal year of like 2025. We're thinking 3 years in advance, which is actually really different in this realm of enterprise technology versus it being, in from what I've seen in tech and at both Twitter and Facebook. I don't think they were thinking 3 years out. The conversation was kind of like, what's the next 6 months look like? Or what does the next year look like? That at the most. 3 year trajectory, not so much. They may have changed that now, but as of when I was working there, it wasn't that far out. And so we're like already in 2025.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, it sounds like such a disciplined organization and such a disciplined and logically run.
Yeah.
So,
Very,
yeah.
very. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Amazing. So I have a final question for you, Candace,
Yeah.
and that is, if you could support anyone in the world throughout the course of history and time, who would you choose to support and why?
This question was really hard for me, mainly because there's so many. To me, I think there's a few people that come to mind that I feel like would be really great to support. But throughout history and time, I'm gonna go with Oprah. um, I, in terms of just who she is as a person, how she looks at life, and then also her philanthropy and like the way that she gives back, I would just want to be a fly on the wall to just understand how um, she does it, to be honest. And I think that there's probably some cool things that we could do together. And being able to, she's just touched so many different people across, I think, the globe, and especially her outreach in Africa and like um, all of that. It's just been amazing to watch, and to me, just what do you call it? Aspirational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. She has certainly come a long way in her life,
Mm.
and accomplished an incredible amount. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great answer. We'll accept that answer. And the nice thing about that is she's still in life and still
I
very active. So
know.
you just
I
never know,
know. You
Candace.
just
You
never
just
know. You
never know.
just
Sometimes
never
when people
know.
say things like, people that are long since gone, it's like, well, that's not happening. But but she is very much still present. So
I
you
mean,
never
I
know.
could, I could pick someone who's no longer living, but I honestly, that's the one that kind of sticks with me, is just even my mantra of like how I want to go about life,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
touch people. It's
Yeah.
not
Well,
always about work, right? You've also got to do
no,
something to like reach out to others.
it's also about legacy, and it's also
Yeah.
about the kind of trails that you want to blaze, and your legacy and how you want to be remembered. And I think that she certainly has a legacy. Candace, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really, really great, not only a great discussion of your experiences, navigating diversity, navigating all of the different interesting directions that your career has taken you, but I think also just a really good reminder of all of the ways that the EA career can generate impact. And I think that was a really, really important reminder of just the incredible reach and expanse that this role can exhibit. So that's what I'm taking away from this conversation. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I love that you said reach of this role, because it does definitely have an extensive reach. And I just want to thank you so much for the time, Jessica. As I mentioned when I started earlier, like Maven has really been. I don't know if I've gotten any of my roles completely through you, but I've definitely have learned a lot about being an executive assistant while working with Maven in different things. And so I just applaud your continuous effort to build such a connection for the community and to host things like this. I think it's great to have conversation with other executive assistants or those who are in the administrative and HR space and learn, be able to take a little tidbits, and then also be able to
Mm-hmm.
just build your community. I think you can do so much more when you are with others who are working towards a similar goal as you, and you can lean on.
Yeah, that's exactly how this gets done. It's by bringing in people who are doing interesting things, who have interesting perspectives, and who are willing to share their knowledge. So thank you for contributing to that canon of voices, as you mentioned, and of
Yes.
knowledge. So
Perfect.
okay,
Okay. Thank you.
thanks so much. Reach is brought to you by Maven Recruiting Group, who specializes in placing executive assistants and support staff to the Bay Area's most prominent executives and companies. If you've enjoyed being part of our podcast community and are interested in becoming part of our candidate community, we're currently hiring for roles in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles. You can visit us at www.mavenrec.com to see some of the roles we're currently working on and to submit your resume.